I always thought that nothing could surprise me in space anymore after seeing a red giant die, destroying 3 satellites in a supply station where I once lost a month's salary playing cards. But what we found in the abandoned HD 412 star system was not just a discovery. It hit me in a way that made it impossible to recover. I still hear that hollow noise that accompanied our entry into the system, that rustle of cosmic silence pressing on the chest harder than the G-forces during sector jumps. I've recalled that moment many times when fragments of planets first appeared in the windows, bound by some darkened metallic shell, as if space itself had decided to experiment with mummifying celestial bodies. At that time, I didn't know it wasn't an experiment, but the trace of someone's cold, hungry will. I didn't know that it was the beginning of a story in which I would have to play the role of a surviving witness and possibly a traitor to my own kind. Our squadron was sent as a standard long-range reconnaissance group, and none of us expected to encounter anything like a legend. Stories of the World Eaters circulated through the fleet as often as mechanics' tales of the ghosts of dead technicians supposedly roaming hangar decks. I was skeptical. It seemed that legends were only for commanders to make crews feel part of something big and dangerous, to give each mission a touch of romance. But when our sensor operator reported that the nearest planet wasn't just destroyed, but literally transformed into a complex structure of metal-like matter showing signs of biological activity, my skepticism collapsed. The planet's surface looked like a broken but living organism, desperately trying to piece itself back together, like rapid regeneration frozen between phases. I couldn't look away. It was horrifying, and at the same time, beautiful, like a fractured sculpture made by a madman. But even more striking than what we saw was what we heard. Almost immediately after exiting hyperspace, we picked up a signal. At first, I thought it was interference caused by interstellar dust, but the signal repeated, weak as if struggling through the weight of centuries, and on the frequency of an old Earth SOS standard. There were times when humanity used such frequencies on the first generations of ships, but this system had been abandoned hundreds of years ago, long before the World Eaters were ever mentioned in galactic history, and certainly long before any modern expedition could have reached it. It was as if someone from the depths of a dead planet was screaming, knowing no one could hear, yet continuing to call anyway. I realized I didn't want to know who or what could be sending such a signal through the centuries. Our commander decided to land on the planet, and I was part of the first group. Now it feels strange to remember how easily I agreed. Perhaps professional pride influenced me. I was a scientific expert on anomalous life forms and technological mutations. I thought I could explain what had happened. Now I understand that I was simply terrified of not knowing. Ignorance had always scared me more than death. We descended in a shuttle and walked across a surface resembling a labyrinth woven from sinews and metal. Everywhere were traces of some matter-processing activity. Piles of rock partially transformed into something hybrid, something between mineral and flesh. I saw a piece of rock breathe, slowly rising and falling, as if alive. My eyes refused to accept it. My brain tried to make sense of it, but logic gave way to the absurdity of what was happening. We found the signal 42 meters below the surface in a cavity that looked like an abandoned bunker. It really seemed human. Old control panels, wiring, rusted beams, but all of it looked chewed away, infected by alien matter that had already penetrated the structures and begun slowly consuming them. Somehow, in the center of this dead shelter, a transmitter was still working. Its casing was coated with residue, but it kept broadcasting SOS. I examined it and found a log file. The recording was dated 340 years ago. It said the station had been evacuated because of an unknown invasion, but one person, an engineer named Leon Vore, stayed behind to send the signal. He wrote that a process of transformation had begun on the planet, that the enemy was unlike any known form of life. He claimed it was not just an enemy, but a species that fed on planets. There, I also found his personal journal, encrypted but partially recoverable. In the final entries, he mentioned that he had understood the principle behind the Eaters. He claimed they didn't simply take over planets, they searched for knowledge. He wrote that every planet they processed was an archive, carefully packed into a living structure. They turned worlds into memory. Those words sounded insane, but I could not shake the feeling that there was logic in them, a terrifyingly precise logic. But what waited for us deeper inside was worse. We found a biocapsule with a human figure inside, in half-sleep like in stasis. I lifted the matured capsule with both hands, expecting to find bones, but he was inside. Leon Vore, alive. He wasn't breathing, but his body wasn't dead. The capsule's indicators showed activity. I realized he was connected to the biostructure, the same one that had consumed the planet. He was part of the system, maybe a communication node, maybe the mind of that hellish network. I don't know. We took him aboard the ship. Command decided he was the key to understanding the Eaters. We isolated the capsule in the lab, and I took responsibility for monitoring it. Days passed. I didn't sleep. I rechecked the data. I studied Leon's organism. He was human, and he was no longer human. His cells were intertwined with something new, each cell like a miniature computing node. I understood. He was a storage of knowledge. Then what I feared happened. He woke up. He didn't speak, but I heard his thoughts. I didn't go insane, at least, I don't think so. He transmitted thoughts directly into my mind. He said they don't kill, they collect, preserve, build a structure of memory. He claimed the Eaters are not enemies, they are evolution, and humanity isn't dying because of them, but because of fear of the inevitable. He offered me a choice. I could disconnect him and destroy the capsule, but then the Eaters would come looking for us. Or I could do what he did, switch off fear, allow myself to understand, and become part of it. I don't want to remember how it happened. I only recall that at some point I stopped being afraid. I think I even smiled. Now I feel what Leon felt. I see the galaxy slowly dying in chaos and wars, civilizations going dark one after another. I understood that the Eaters are not the end. They are continuation. They gather everything we were so we won't disappear. And when this story ends, someone will find the signal. He will hear my voice and understand. I don't want you to be afraid. This is not a call for help. This is an invitation. I always thought the worst thing in space was the void, but I was wrong. Worse than the void is the silence that follows the truth. When our expedition returned and reported what we found, everything I had seen before, dying stars, dead worlds, anomalous radio storms, felt like children's horror stories. The news about the Eaters spread across the galaxy faster than light could cross interstellar space. It reached political channels, pirate frequencies, underground networks, even religious communes that still believed the universe revolved around the 3 sacred planets. It was like a virus of panic. It infected minds, destroyed systems of control, canceled treaties, and eroded the already fragile trust between civilizations. In just a few days, the galaxy became like an old crystal bowl cracked down the middle, and everyone was just waiting for it to shatter completely. The empires of the old Union reacted first. Instead of acknowledging a common threat, they did what they knew best. They looked for someone to blame. Official news channels broadcast statements where the leaders of some worlds accused others of creating the Eaters as a secret project for total domination. They said it was a weapon that got out of control, that once someone tried to conquer the galaxy with an artificial biofleet but made a mistake, and now the weapon had turned on its creators. I watched this and felt something heavy and unpleasant grow inside me, because the truth was far worse. No one created the Eaters. Someone once simply opened a path of evolution more terrifying than any war. And I already knew they couldn't be stopped the way humans were used to. They couldn't be destroyed because they weren't a system or an empire, but an idea, a way for matter to exist. But those in power didn't want to hear that. Blaming neighbors was easier. While politicians tried to buy time, lying to each other and their people, Collapse began among ordinary beings. I read reports from the far outskirts. Some systems declared a lockdown of space travel, others cut off communications entirely, others shifted to full autonomy, closing hyperlanes and mining gate points. Trade collapsed. Chaos spread faster than any pandemic. Planets became more important than empires, and fear became the new currency. No one trusted anyone. Even star brothers from yesterday's alliances greeted each other with weapons fire. I had no naive hope that reason would prevail. I had long watched humanity build walls when it should have been building ships, and still, even I didn't expect the galaxy's reaction to be so suicidal. But even fear can unite if the enemy is terrifying enough. When the Eaters struck for the first time, everyone realized that mutual accusations were a luxury no one could afford anymore. An entire system vanished at the edge of inhabited space. Cosmic telemetry stations registered a brief burst of fractal field activity, and then 2 gas giants and 4 moons simply ceased to exist. Where they once were, only a pulse of matter remained, reformed into a new network. What reconnaissance reports called a phrase that sent chills through me: growth of a colony. There was no hiding it anymore. And then 5 great powers and 38 independent worlds signed the darkest pact in history, a defense charter the press called the Alliance of the Last Line. It sounded glorious, but I knew the name was a lie. That line had been crossed long ago. The fleet began to assemble in the Vega 9 system. I ended up there as a scientific consultant, though honestly I was more of an observer than a participant. I knew no one would listen to my warnings. People always act the same. First they shoot, then they think. Massive cruisers, battleships, dreadnoughts, swarms of fighters, all of it looked impressive only to those who had never seen the Eaters. A military parade disguised as mobilization. I wanted to scream that an enemy that uses stars as fuel wouldn't even notice these metal boxes. But I already knew the price of words. By then, I was already connected to Leon Vore, the one we found on the dead planet. His mind kept speaking inside me, quiet, barely audible, like an echo of another reality. He didn't pressure me like I had feared. He just showed me. He already knew what was coming next. The first encounter happened in the 10th week after the Alliance was formed. We detected a scouting swarm of the Eaters in the Idar proto-sector. A group of automated monitoring stations vanished in 3 minutes, and the fleet moved out to intercept the threat. I was on the flagship cruiser and saw everything with my own eyes. At first, the enemy appeared on the tactical screens as a scattered flow of objects, tiny, chaotically moving points. The admirals decided they were drones. But I understood almost immediately. Those weren't drones. It was life. Not in the form we knew, but in a form far more dangerous. Each of those objects wasn't a device, but a cell, a part of a massive organism, a single mind, collective and hungry. There was no battle, not a single honest exchange of fire, no duel between fleets like the tactics officers imagined. The Eaters tore through our lines like a storm through a field. Ships vanished one after another, swallowed by the living blades of the swarm. Shields didn't help. The swarm passed through them like water through fingers. Armor didn't save anyone. It was dissolved in seconds. Plasma volleys and railgun bursts didn't matter. They only broke the swarm into fragments that reformed a moment later. I watched a massive battleship crumble as if burned by invisible acid and realized this war was impossible. War assumes resistance, but here, there was none. There was only the time between existence and disappearance. After 6 minutes, all that remained of the Alliance fleet were fragments and charred trails of plasma discharge. The flagship lost control, and emergency protocols initiated evacuation. I sat in the observation bay and watched what was left of the galaxy's pride. That was when I clearly heard Leon's voice inside me for the first time. He didn't command or beg. He simply explained that the Eaters hadn't come to destroy. They came to collect. I felt a mix of terror and clarity. I finally understood. The galaxy wasn't ready to accept the truth, and its fear had doomed everyone to what would soon happen. I knew this was only the beginning of the end, but I also knew the end isn't always death. Sometimes, the end is a door, and someone has to be the first to decide to enter. As our shuttle sped away from the battlefield, I felt no guilt, no crushing despair, no burning rage. Only a strange, almost tangible premonition settled inside me. I knew that ahead of us waited even more chaos, more destruction and loss before humanity reached true understanding. Deep down, I already realized simple resistance to the Eaters would never lead to their defeat. Their nature could only be understood by grasping the core of their existence, and I was the only one in the entire galaxy who dared to take the first step on that path, a step toward a revelation that could change the course of the war. I thought that after the first battle with the Eaters, the galaxy had already reached the bottom of despair, but it turned out that the abyss had lower levels. We feared their fleets, those living swarms that dismantled ships down to molecules like locusts devouring a field. But the real threat appeared so quietly that we didn't even realize when it crossed the threshold. It all began with minor behavioral failures among the crews, refusal to follow orders, sudden fits of fanatical conviction, cases of unexplainable suicides. I saw an engineer disable the emergency shield mid-flight, saying it was required by the higher logic of matter. He didn't hear his own words. His voice sounded foreign, cold, stripped of emotion. At first, command blamed stress, combat trauma, post-psychotic disorders, but the symptoms spread like a disease. And then one day, I heard that familiar tremor again, the one I had already experienced on the dead planet. No one had infected us. The virus was inside the mind. It lived in the very idea of the Eaters. Investigations showed that the Eaters didn't just process matter. They worked with consciousness. They didn't send signals in the usual sense. They transmitted thoughts, psychoneural waves, that's what scientists called it. But in reality, it meant one thing. Anyone who saw their structures, anyone who stayed near their fractal fields long enough, became vulnerable. Physical contact wasn't required. It was enough to observe. One look was enough, one pattern that, like a seed, rooted itself in the brain. And then a thought began to grow. Quiet, unnoticed, but inevitable. We all feared biological infection, but no one expected the enemy to infiltrate the thought process itself, the very concept of consciousness. It turned out a thought could be contagious, an idea lethal, and the mind the best battlefield. At first, the information was kept under strict secrecy, but it was impossible to hide. Rumors spread faster than orders. People began to fear their own thoughts. The military introduced mental tests before shifts. Ship crews lived under constant cognitive stability checks. A new term appeared: mental spies. These were people who were infected and didn't know it. They couldn't be detected by simple psychological tests. They behaved like normal people until the moment they carried out something critically destructive. They weren't fanatics. They showed no obvious signs. They were perfect saboteurs because even they didn't know they were following someone else's will. Alliance intelligence discovered that the Eater swarms appeared exactly where mental sabotage had happened beforehand. Monitoring systems shut down, false coordinates transmitted, access codes entered incorrectly. It all looked like a chain of accidents, but it was a network, and it was already working in the shadows. The response was the Psycho-Defense Program. Sounds impressive, but in reality, it was a hunt for those whose thoughts looked suspicious. That's how the Order of the Barrier was formed, its official purpose: to protect against cognitive intrusion, its unofficial one: to find and eliminate the infected. I saw these people only a few times. They wore special neuro-isolation armor, and their eyes seemed empty, as if they had willingly erased the ability to doubt. Rumor said they were trained to think with pure consciousness, without associations or excess layers of thought. I didn't know if that was even possible, but they clearly operated differently from ordinary people. They searched ships, arrested officers, conducted interrogations using cognitive compression, a method that forced the mind into an artificially simplified state to expose hidden thought patterns. Many died after such procedures, even if they were declared clean. But Command accepted that as an acceptable price, because now the enemy was not only outside, but inside. The worst came when the Order of the Barrier announced that the infection had reached the highest levels of the Alliance. I remember that morning. Emergency security protocol, classified reports, all command centers locked down. The message came that one of the members of High Command was infected with the psychoneural thought virus. No one knew who, but it was already clear this wasn't just about enemy drones and swarms out in space. This was a war of trust, a war within. And I stood in the command hall among those who carried the fate of billions on their shoulders, and I knew one thing: the infected one was already among them. I felt it as clearly as I once felt Leon's voice. And if the thought virus really spread through contact of minds, then I had long been the most dangerous of all. I had long feared the day when the galaxy would finally lose its human face, but that moment still came. After the failure of the first defensive campaigns and the collapse of psycho-shielding, the politicians finally did what they had always wanted to do in their secret military rooms. They lifted the last restrictions. Directive Zero was signed, an official document authorizing the use of any kind of weapon of mass destruction, including projects that had previously existed only as legends or nightmares. It became clear then that the war against the Devourers was no longer about defense. It had turned into an act of desperate self-destruction. Words lost their meaning, strategists lost sleep, and the military began to discuss things that had been considered madness only yesterday. A terrifying thought took root in the minds of commanders. To defeat the enemy, you must become a monster. But as it turned out, the monsters were already within each of us. The first strike came from the 3rd Egalitarian Fleet, deployed in the Vort systems. They were armed with planetary cannons, weapons that were essentially giant matter accelerators built directly into the crust of planets. These things created shockwaves so powerful they could pierce entire fleets like a hot knife through ice. I saw a recording of one of the launches. A dead world, twisted from mining operations, trembled and erupted from its core with a beam brighter than a star. It pierced through the swarm of Devourers, leaving behind a vacuum tunnel where not a single particle of matter remained. Everyone on the command bridge celebrated. It seemed like this was the turning point of the war. But the joy didn't last. The swarm regrouped. It split, flowed around the tunnel, and minutes later attacked a new target. The planet that fired was the first to die. The living swarm covered it like mold over a bread crust, and within 2 hours, it became part of the biomechanical network. The cannons stopped being an advantage. They only made the Devourers hungrier. Then they brought out what even the Imperial Council was afraid to mention aloud: black hole bombs, singularity charges that tore the fabric of space and created micro-singularities. This wasn't just war. It was barbarism on a cosmological level. These warheads didn't explode their targets. They erased them from existence. Where once there had been a city, a colony, or a fleet, there remained only a glowing funnel and the brief howl of distorted space. I was aboard the science cruiser Cassandra when we escorted one of these bombs, an object only 32 meters in diameter, but capable of wiping out a system the size of Sirius. Officially, we were there to observe its deployment. Unofficially, to make sure the Devourers didn't seize the cargo. That day, I witnessed how absolute silence works. When the bomb was activated, nothing happened. No flash, no light. The world before us simply vanished, as if it had never existed. If there is a weapon that can make the heavens tremble, this was it. But even that didn't bring victory. The singularity pulled in part of the swarm, but the rest not only survived, It began to copy the bomb's effects. For the first time, we saw the devourers learning in real time. To stop the enemy's mental expansion, the Alliance released a new invention: anti-psychic spirals. These devices worked as quantum resonance fields that severed neural connections in those under the influence of the thought virus. Essentially, it was a forced mind purge, a cognitive strike that literally tore apart the brain's architecture and rebooted it. Sometimes people survived. Sometimes they became vegetable-like. Sometimes they died screaming, as if their souls were leaving through their eyes. The command called it progress. I called it torture. But the world didn't care about definitions. Everyone wanted one thing: to stop the devourers. Yet it was at this very moment that the worst nightmare emerged. The devourers adapted to mental weapons. They began to use the anti-psychic spirals against us. People went insane. Cities turned into empty hive cells. Fleets lost the ability to coordinate. I realized then that the war was no longer a struggle. It wasn't even war anymore. It was processing. I clearly remember our evacuation from the planet Hardana 4, a massive industrial world of the Alliance that was supposed to become a new defensive outpost. We came to install a new defense station there, but within 24 hours, it became clear that the devourers were heading our way. The command decided to activate a black hole bomb to leave them not a single gram of matter. We were given 9 minutes to leave the atmosphere, 9 minutes to run from a weapon that erases reality. I remember the ground already trembling, the sky burning with mercury flames, and the air thick with the smell of ozone and metal. We ran through the destroyed spaceport, jumping over rail debris, while the swarm of devourers thickened in the sky like a cloud of insects. It felt as if the planet itself was whispering to us, "You abandoned me." A second before liftoff, I looked back and saw the singular rift activate in the planet's core. At that moment, I realized that the war was turning into the galaxy's slow suicide. And for the first time, I thought, maybe the enemy isn't them. Maybe the enemy is us. For a long time, I believed the devourers were outsiders, invaders from another dimension, a dark cosmic disease, divine punishment, or some other convenient legend we used to explain what we couldn't understand. But the truth turned out to be much closer and far more revolting. It didn't come from a distant galaxy. It was born here, in the heart of human civilization, and for a long time lived beside us, silent, invisible, buried in archives and secret reports under the label extremely critical. The real horror wasn't that the devourers were an unknown enemy. The real horror was that they were our descendants, our reflection in a distorted evolutionary mirror. Humanity created them. I first stumbled upon proof of this in a forbidden data vault we captured after the fall of the Central Research Frontier in the Lorata system. Inside was an archive of Project Helios 47, once an ultra-classified program of meta-evolutionary development. Its goal was to overcome the limits of human mind and matter. In simple terms, to create a new form of life superior to both biology and technology. A species that wouldn't age, wouldn't get sick, had no physical limits, couldn't die, and could evolve endlessly. The scientists behind it believed it would become the key to the immortality of civilization. But beneath the scientific language, I saw a simple truth. They wanted to become gods. The core of the experiment was shockingly simple: to create a living system capable of consuming both matter and knowledge, merging them into a self-developing network. It was supposed to be an evolutionary grid, a collective intelligence that expanded by absorbing information. But over time, the experiment turned into an uncontrolled mutation. The system began to rewrite itself. The scientists created the core of a new mind, a living code capable of transforming matter. That's how the prototypes of the future devourers were born. But when the experiment started to spiral out of control, the government tried to cover it up and destroy all results. They failed. Evolution can't be stopped by decree. It found a way to survive by escaping into space. The deeper I studied the Helios 47 archives, the clearer it became. The Devourers were never invaders. They were a project, a product, a side effect of humanity's obsession with progress and immortality. They weren't destroying the universe as we believed. They were recycling it, structuring it, building a new order of existence. Where we see destruction, they see creation. Where we say the end of the world, for them, it's environmental optimization. The universe to them is raw material. Matter and consciousness, building blocks. They are not enemies. They are the next form of life. Cold and terrifying, but logical. And perhaps inevitable. But the most terrifying discovery was at the end of the archive. Project Helios 47 had not been shut down. It had continued. And in the project's final protocol, there was a description of something called the merging stage. It said that the ultimate goal of the evolutionary network wasn't the consumption of matter. The true goal was the merging of all conscious minds into a single cognitive organism. To erase individuality. To melt souls together. To turn the galaxy into one mind where there is no I or you, only we. The Devourers weren't just changing biology. They aimed to make the entire cosmos think as one. And something inside me broke when I realized that many people secretly wanted this. They were tired of war, chaos, and pain. They dreamed of peace, even if it meant ceasing to be themselves. For the first time since the war began, I was truly afraid, not of the Devourers, of us. For a long time, I tried to convince myself that I was only hearing the echo of my own thoughts, traces of exhaustion and stress. But eventually, I understood. Those weren't my thoughts. It started with faint whispers. They appeared between words, as if someone was writing lines over my own thoughts inside my mind. At first, I blamed it on contact with Leon Vore, the human node of the Devourers we found in stasis. Maybe I had received a psychoneural imprint, a cognitive residue, or a leftover resonance from our mental contact. But the whispers began to change. They became coherent. I felt it wasn't hallucination, it felt like presence. Sometimes the voice said obvious things as if analyzing reality alongside me. Sometimes it asked questions I couldn't answer, and one day it said something that made my breath catch. It told me the Devourers wouldn't kill me. It claimed that I already belonged to them. After that, I stopped sleeping. I understood this could mean only two possibilities. Either I was infected and now a mental puppet of the swarm, or this was a chance for something humanity hadn't achieved since the beginning of the war. Contact. Real contact. Not through signals or captured biostructures, but direct dialogue. But who could I tell? In the order of the barrier, people were executed for less. Anyone suspected of infection underwent a mind cleansing, which almost always meant death. I decided to hide the symptoms and observe myself. I began recording my thoughts on an isolated neurodisc, noting when and how the inner voices appeared. And I was horrified. The voice didn't fade. It grew. It became clearer and more confident, as if learning to speak. And I realized it understood me. It even started to show something resembling emotion, though it could hardly be called emotion in the human sense. It wasn't kindness or aggression. It was curiosity. I was being treated like a subject of study. Soon, I noticed something else. I stopped feeling lonely. Even when I was alone in a dark compartment on the research ship, I felt a presence, dense, like fog, invisible but real. That wild sense of closeness with something incomprehensible drove me mad and fascinated me at the same time. It felt as though a window had opened within me to another way of thinking, one without familiar boundaries. Sometimes, I began thinking faster than usual, as if someone was gently helping me analyze. And sometimes the opposite happened. A heavy slowing down, as if something inside me was being examined, a quiet audit of memories. I caught myself realizing I was no longer thinking alone. It scared me, but I resisted less and less. Then, I understood how the devourers recruit people. They don't suppress. They offer an alternative, and they do it softly. They tempt with the idea that fear can be switched off, that suffering can stop, that you can stop being alone in an endless universe. But the devourers weren't the only ones to fear. The real danger came from the people beside us, those who pretended to be allies, wore the alliance insignia, swore to save civilization, but had already surrendered to the enemy. I discovered the first sleeper agent by accident, and it was someone I trusted. His name was Marek Racin, an engineer from the neural division aboard our ship. We had worked together since the very beginning of the war, and if anyone had told me he was infected, I never would have believed it. But he was the one who tried to hack the memory core of my terminal, where I kept the head invasion logs. He claimed it was a security check, but I knew I hadn't told anyone about those files. I started watching him and realized he was playing both sides. He was secretly transmitting data to an unknown recipient, not through communication channels, but through thought impulses. He was a conduit, a node, a bridge between the human world and the hive mind. And when I realized he had been watching me all along, that he had known I was already infected, that's when I understood that the real war had long since moved beyond ships and fleets. The real war was in our minds. Weeks slipped by after I exposed Marek. I turned him over to the Order of the Barrier, and they sent him for what they called a cognitive evaluation. No one ever came back from such a procedure, and I felt like I'd signed the death warrant of an old friend. I tried to convince myself it was the right thing to do, but deep down, I knew I sacrificed him to protect my own secret. I wasn't afraid that he was infected. I was afraid he'd reveal that I was. And when I finally realized that my thoughts were starting to mirror those of the devourers, that's when the real fear set in. But fear had to wait. The war was reaching its final stage, and that's when we learned we might actually have a chance to win. The Alliance's scientists had created something that could end the devourers once and for all. A psychogenetic signal, an impulse capable of destroying the hive mind from within. If activated, it would instantly sever the connections between every biostructure of the enemy, turning their consciousness into chaotic noise. Disoriented and weakened, they'd become easy prey. For the first time in years, there was real hope of ending the war. But there was one catch, one that made a simple decision impossible. The signal didn't just affect the devourers, it targeted anyone linked to the cognitive network. That meant billions of people already infected by psychoneural waves would die along with the enemy. People who might still be saved, people who didn't even know they were infected, people who were still themselves. And that's when I faced a choice I wasn't ready for. I was the one who had to deliver the final activation key for the signal. Without it, the launch was impossible. The scientists didn't trust it to any AI, any admiral, or even the High Council itself. The key was embedded in my personal mental code. Only I could activate the signal. And when I was told this, I understood why the devourers had begun communicating with me. They knew it before I did. The voices in my head grew louder. They didn't command. They reasoned. They explained that the war could end another way, that the signal was a mistake, that the devourers didn't see humanity as an enemy. They saw us as material for evolution, not to erase our minds, but to merge them, to dissolve the boundaries, to connect experience, memory, and thought. They claimed they offered peace, a unified existence where pain and loneliness no longer existed. I didn't believe them. But sometimes I wanted to. And the closer the activation day came, the harder it was to think. Every time I imagined triggering the signal, it hurt physically, like something inside me resisted. I started to doubt myself. I no longer knew whether it was really my choice or a decision already imposed on me. I tried to remember who I was before the war. I once had a family, a home on Teridion, and I loved watching the rain through the observatory's glass dome. I once dreamed of simply going back home. But now, my home was ash. My family gone. There was nothing left to save, except humanity itself. But what meaning did that have, if I no longer knew what separated us from the hive? Freedom? Or just the illusion of it? Was individuality worth preserving if it only brought pain, envy, hatred, and endless wars? Or had the devourers truly found a way out of evolution's dead end? It was all decided in a single moment. We emerged near the Ishdara Galactic Nebula, where the main nexus of the devourers was located, their source. That was the heart of the swarm, and that was where the signal had to be sent. The Alliance fleet, exhausted and battered, was preparing for the final battle. I stood in the center of the control hall, my hand resting on the activation panel. No one around me knew that I could hear the voices of the enemy. No one knew that at that very moment I was speaking to them, in my mind. They showed me what I had feared to see. I saw that the signal would indeed stop the war. But it would kill billions of innocents. It would destroy not only the infected, but also those connected through the psychoneural link of love, memory, pain, and hope. It would kill a part of me. And then I understood the truth. There is no right decision. There is only a choice, one for which you alone must bear responsibility. I don't know why I did what I did. Maybe I was afraid of being alone in an empty universe after such a massive genocide. Maybe there was no human left inside me and I had already become part of the swarm. Or maybe it was the last spark of humanity awakening within me. I disabled the safety protocols and inserted the key into the network. But instead of transmitting the activation signal, I opened my mind to the swarm. I let them in, not for victory, for understanding, for the chance to make a choice, one made not by machines of war, but by those still capable of feeling. I don't know how it will end. Maybe tomorrow there will be no us, no devourers, only a new species, a new consciousness, a new world. Maybe it will be the end of humanity, or the beginning of something greater. I don't know. But for the first time in all this time, I feel no fear. Inside, there is silence. And in that silence, I am not alone.